Okay.
Bro, Spider-Man's on my men's call. Look, the chair looks like Spider-Man.
I thought the chair was really far away and it was a beanbag chair. So when Nolan just grabbed it, I was really confused.
Right.
Okay, let's pray. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Dear Lord, thank you for this day. We thank you for the gift of life. We thank you for your blessings. We thank you for safe travels all the way to Minnesota. Thank you for brotherhood. Thank you for the gift of the Holy Spirit, that we can continue to animate our faith and to help others grow closer to you, Lord. Mother Mary, we thank you for your protection, and we just want to give all the glory to you, Lord, as we say, glory be to the Father, to the Son, to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So the very last talk of the summer, which I think is actually super cool, is on self-control. So when I was praying about self-control, I don't usually do this, but the first thing I did actually was I decided to go to the catechism, because the catechism is like loaded with material for self-control. And so the very first thing that the catechism brought up, which I absolutely loved, so this is what they talk about when it comes to, they talk about self-control as self-mastering, mastering one's passions, one's desires, oneself to glorify the Lord. And oftentimes, like in a very broad sense, like when we talk about self-control, for men at least, it's almost always catered towards our sexuality, chastity, and purity, right? And even like in the catechism, that like a lot of the times when you see self-control, it's always in the form of like earthly things, like asceticism. And so the first thing is from the catechism, paragraph 2340. It says, whoever wants to remain faithful to their baptismal promises and resist temptations want to adopt the means by doing so. This requires self-knowledge and self-mastery. The practice of an ascesis, just fancy word of saying asceticism, adapted to the situations that confronts oneself. Obedience to God's commandments, exercising moral virtues, and fidelity to prayer. So, and then they ended on, indeed, it is through chastity that we are gathered together and led back to the unity for which we were fragmented into multiplicity. So the big thing that they talk about for it, just like in this paragraph, is with self-knowledge or self-control, it takes practice of asceticism, so like dying to oneself, right? Obedience to God, like his commandments, right? Obedience to the word, exercising our moral judgment and virtue, and then our fidelity and like our prayer. And so the thing that really strikes me is the very end, though, because when they talk about self-control in the form of chastity, man, I just want to read again, because it's actually a lot deeper than you think about. Indeed, it's through chastity that we are gathered together and led back to unity, from which we were fragmented into multiplicity. So they're saying through self-control, through our chastity, we become a community again. Because as a community of people who are pure, who are chaste, we become one again and whole. Like, if you think about it, it's like, whoa, I didn't even actually, like, the first time I read, I didn't realize it's so true. Like, we all come from so many different walks of life, but like the way we're fragmented or we feel shattered is always like in life experiences of, like, you see people with sexual abuse, right, rape, like so many different horrific things that happen, that like that in and of itself, like the destruction of man's sexuality is what splits us, you know. That like really hit deep for me. And so that is what they talked about, the first part, right, for self-control, is they give us like those 4 outliers. And then the second part they talk about under self-control, we actually like put it in reverse, Terry. We go back to paragraph 1734. Thank you for that. I had to.
Wait, can you say the last sentence again?
Put it in reverse, Terry?
No, like the last thing you said before.
It's just like from or self-control that comes from like asceticism. So the first part of self-control they talk about is asceticism in the Catechism. So we go to paragraph 1734, and it says, and this is actually like a really big chunk of the Catechism, is like this entire part, the entire article of this part of the Catechism is literally just called man's freedom. It's for our freedom, like as men, as people of God, like as chosen people. This entire part is based on our freedom. And the first thing that they talk about underneath it is our freedom and our responsibility. And underneath that, they strictly just talk about chastity as the number one thing, as our responsibility. Like, is our responsibility as people who are striving for the Lord to be chaste. And so in paragraph 1734, it says, freedom makes man responsible for his actions to the extent that they're voluntary. Progress in virtue and knowledge of the good and asceticism enhances our will over our actions. So it's like through our practice of asceticism, through our responsibility of who we are as children of God, we come into a greater realization of freedom. And like right before that, it talks about how our choice to disobey and do evil is an abuse of our freedom and leads to slavery of sin, not just in our lives, but in others, right? I've seen that at a very personal level in my own family of mistakes that me and my brother have made, Joseph, that have led to bondage and slavery of sin from our little brothers, of disobedience, of like rebellion towards our parents. And that like in and of itself is very real and practical, because now that we're both older and we see our little brothers growing up, it's like the struggles and addictions we've had with pornography or anything else, it's like those all stem from what? Disobedience. And that's what it says. It's like when we disobey, we're abusing our freedom. So like the first thing we do as responsible Christians, as followers of Christ and people who live in the Spirit as a community, is to obey who we are in the freedom that we're given, right? Like live in the freedom of who we are as children of God. So that was like the second really big thing that the Catechism was showing me right off the bat with self-control, is self-control literally equals freedom. And so when I was sitting there thinking about it too, it was like, what is the opposite of self-control, right? Like, so we know that our self-control leads to freedom, but like, what is the opposite of our freedom? What is the opposite of our self-control? And the first thing that was brought to my attention in prayer was the 7 deadly sins. Every single one of those things are the complete opposite of obedience and of self-control. So the 7 deadly sins are lust, gluttony, pride, sloth, anger, greed, and envy. So like every single one of those, we could look at an example and every single one of those sins and understand how that is the complete opposite of obedience and self-control, right? Like when we allow the Spirit to be manifested in our lives, he illuminates those parts of ourselves that's like, holy crap, I am a very broken person. So like a great example of that for me recently has been like right after Ascend in January, I went on my annual silent retreat. And we take like a solid 8 days of just pure silence and prayer. And then we have like a retreat director who we like report to and we talk with. And the common theme for me throughout this retreat this year was lust. But it wasn't in my sexual lust. It wasn't like in my sexual impurities. It was my lust for control, my lust for power. Because like ultimately, when we want control, when we lust for control, we lose what? Surrender to the Lord. And so like that's a very applicable reason why lusting is the opposite of self-control, right? We control our desires. We understand what our desires are. So if I like, and it's true too, like to this, like even this past month has been excruciatingly painful with trying to decide school, life, internships, everything going on. It's like I constantly, and because of that retreat, I'm constantly being aware now of when am I lusting for control? When am I trying to like grab onto things that I know I can determine because it makes me feel like I have power. You know what I mean? So like then there's gluttony, right? I feel like this one gluttony actually is like a lot more intense than we think about, but on like a very shallow surface level. Like we think of gluttony as like, hey, don't eat too much food, you know? So like, but gluttony can manifest itself not just in food, but like in our workouts. Like people are gluttons for workout. You know what I mean? Like dudes who are constantly working out because they want to look good. Like that's a gluttony. You're just a glutton for vanity. And like, it's interesting because when we talk or like when I evaluate some of the situations that I see it in my own life, it's all like all the 7 deadly sins are connected, like all the way. Because like, what is it? If I'm a glutton for working out, then what am I? I'm just prideful. I'm trying to be vain and prideful, right? And if I'm prideful, then I'm just envious or greedy of what others have, right? That I don't have. So like they all connect each other all the time. So like that's a really simple way of like describing like gluttony and pride, sloth. Like self-control isn't about like not doing something. It's also about action, right? So like sloth in many ways can be our laziness, maybe physically. Sloth is like, what's a really good definition of it?
It's like knowing that you're supposed to do something and then deciding to just do nothing instead.
Yeah, it's like
What was the first part?
usually sloth is like on a very like surface level. Sloth is like, oh, I'm supposed to do this, I decide not to. Like in a way you can just call it laziness. So like, but like that's the most basic way we see sloth. But like the more I've prayed and the more I've like had to assess my own life, the more I realize like sloth is also very much a part of like my spiritual life, but also like when I don't take action or when I should take action, you know? Sometimes like I'll make myself too busy, that way I don't have to do other things, right? And like that in and of itself is like pretty blatantly the complete opposite of self-control, right? Like I understand what I need to do, so I have the awareness, but I lack the self-control to actually carry that out, right? Or because awareness, I know, oh, I don't want to do this. And then it's actually like the most pure form of sloth, and then I refuse to, right? And there's like always more layers to them, you know. I think that was just like a super quick example that came off the top of my head. Something I see constantly in my life is anger, especially right now, right? Like we get angry at COVID or the things I can't control, or like people's reactions toward COVID, or the fact that our Democratic governor is shooting our state in the foot and killing small businesses makes me very angry. You know, like those are ways that I can exercise self-control in like, instead of becoming angry in those situations, to be able to take a step back and just pray. Like literally be like, come Holy Spirit, you understand my emotion. Like help me to come into awareness of what you want, Lord. And it's like that, once again, it kind of like leads back, like self-control isn't just freedom. Self-control like takes surrender. So like in order to achieve self-control, we have to surrender a part of ourselves at some point. So that's like a simple form of anger, or like greed, constantly wanting for something that's not ours, right? Or envy. So after I was thinking about like the opposite virtues of self-control as like those big ones, I was just praying, and I was like, well, Lord, I don't really know where to go from here. And so usually I'll just start flipping through my Bible. Literally, I'll just start going, and then eventually I'll just be like, okay, stop. And I'll just like open it up. And usually the Lord gives me what I need.
Bible roulette.
Yeah, dude, it happens all the time. It's awesome. And the thing that actually came up was Romans chapter 7, verses 18. And Paul talks about his human struggle. And he says, for I know the good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do good, but I cannot carry it out. And I think ultimately what the Lord was showing me in that is like, it reminded me of a homily that Father Mike Schmitz gave over the COVID outbreak when we were watching him as a family on Sundays. Was he talked about how our reality, like we are born into sin. We are born into a shattered world. That's our reality. We try to make our reality security, or like that everything is okay. Like we create a false reality for ourselves. And so like when I was reading this, what came to me was like the amount of self-control but surrender that Paul had to write to the Romans and say like, I know that I live in a broken world, that like I by myself am nothing. And he's like, I know that I have the desire to do good. I just can't carry it out. I just can't do it, you know? And that like really resonated with me, especially this morning when I was praying, because it's like I can't control any of what's going on outside of me, besides the things I can't control in my day-to-day life and like my walk with the Lord. And like to recognize that for men to struggle isn't anything new. Like it's not something that just like pop, oh man, everyone's got porn addictions. Like that's been happening far longer than we've existed, you know? And so I think what the Lord was really showing me was just like a response to surrender of like my own struggles and failures. And out of that, I was given Second Peter. I gotta flip to it quick. It was 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. And Peter, like I saw this almost as a response to Paul saying, like, I'm struggling. I know I want to do good. I just can't do it. And like I almost saw this in like a response from Peter, where Peter says in verse 5, for this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with steadfastness, steadfastness with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love. And so that was like the nail in the coffin for me for self-control, right? It's because he's like, here's your natural progression, okay? He said, start out by building faith with virtue. Trust in the Lord means we live virtuous lives, right? Our faith in the Lord comes with virtue. After that, you've got virtue. Now build upon it with the knowledge that God gives you, right? Study the word, your daily prayer life. So out of your virtue, build your knowledge, right? And then out of your knowledge, you gain self-control. Because now that you have knowledge, now that you're aware of what's going on, you're able to control yourself. You're able to surrender. You're able to be free, right? And that's almost what he says next, is he says, now with self-control, move into steadfastness. Steadfastness, I mean, you can just interpret that as perseverance. Like, now that you have your self-control, even if you slip up and fall, don't give up. Like, you have self-control now. Keep moving. Like, keep persevering. Fight the good fight. And then from there, steadfastness with godliness. I mean, godliness can be interpreted also as like righteousness, right? Sinlessness. So now that you're persevering, strive for sinlessness. Fight sin, like win back the ground. And I've always seen this verse as like a battle, right? Because like you see it in steps. And like I can almost put myself at where I'm at right now, it's like, okay, now that I'm persevering, now work towards godliness, right? Righteousness, to be sinless, to be pure, and to help lead others to Christ, right? And then I love the end, because as a community of men who are striving for the Lord, that's what we want, right? Like that's what we work for. And so when he says, and I just like the end, because he goes, and with self-control and godliness, move towards brotherly affection. And brotherly affection comes love, right? So like now that we work so hard to become righteous through self-control, we find brotherhood, we find communion, right? Like that's what the catechism is talking about, is like once we have that communion, because of what sin and destruction has shattered us apart, now we find unity and chastity and self-control. We become brothers, right? And out of our brotherhood comes love. And like the greatest of these gifts is love, right? Like the only thing, I think the song that came to me after I read it was like, and they'll know we are Christians by our love, right? Like, especially in a time where people are rioting and protesting, and there's racial hate, and there's like a lot of animosity. And it's funny because even in my own life, I recognize like the places I go or the people I communicate with now, like I can feel tension when there's different races in the room. You can literally feel it. Yeah. Like to walk up and say, just today, I was in a gas station and I held the door for a black man, and he goes, "Oh, dude, you don't have to do that." I was like, no. I was like, just please go ahead. And like one of the gas station ladies who saw it was like, like that's so awesome. Like I'm glad that you guys are like sticking up for each other, because like there's like so much tension between like white versus black now when it's really not, right? And so like they'll know we are Christians by our love, like by wanting the good for another, you know. That's something that like in the end, like perfect love casts out all fear. As we are a community of brothers, as we are a community of love in the Holy Spirit, we become fearless, like fearless warriors, like a brotherhood. So just now when I was looking up saints who exemplify self-control, I didn't recognize this, but the first one that came up was actually Saint Maximilian Kolbe, which is awesome because I didn't know he is the patron saint of people struggling with addictions.
Wow.
The site said for helping in response to addiction, people turn to Maximilian Kolbe, the saint and martyr who is the patron saint of those suffering from addiction. Born in Poland, deeply devoted to Our Lady since he was a child, became a priest and was referred to as the martyr of Auschwitz. 1941, while he was imprisoned in the concentration camp, he took the place of a husband and father who had been randomly chosen to be killed. Because of the saint's extraordinary compassion, the family man survived the concentration camp, and St. John Paul II proclaimed that the martyr was the patron saint of our difficult age. And isn't that incredible, especially for a group of guys right now, to think about the addictions and the problems that plague us, you know, is to be able to turn to Maximilian Kolbe. The one that came off the top of my head was Thomas Aquinas, because I don't know if you guys have ever heard like the story or the rumor, is that his brother, okay, so he had a sick family, dude. Thomas Aquinas' family was messed up. They were like super rich. They were all like barons and baronesses in Spain at the time. And his brother was trying to force him to like more or less stop being a priest, leave the holy orders, and go back to like a normal way of life in the family. And so he had sent prostitutes to his chamber when he was literally imprisoned by his own family. His brother sends prostitutes in to tempt him. And the story goes, he grabs a burning log from the fire and like just stands up. And Thomas Aquinas is also known as the dumb ox, right? Because he was a huge, and people used to make fun of him, even though the guy's like probably one of the smartest dude that's walked the earth. And he literally stands up he just grabs a burning log out of the fire and just chases him out, right? Like, you want to talk about radical chastity?
Yeah.
Like, that guy is the epitome of it, right? To come face to face with like that struggle, that addiction, and to be able to stand up and to fight it off with the Holy Spirit, the fire, is like, wow, you know? So yeah, that's all I got for self-control. But I think the verse that I will be constantly praying with now for the next few months is going to be 2 Peter 1:5-8, because it's like our Second Peter chapter 1 verses 5-8, of just like becoming a brotherhood, and through that brotherhood and through self-control, we become a community of love and like hope for other people. So yeah, that's all I got.